And this little kid, I guess he didn't know any better. He was 5 or 6 years old. And if I was walking down the street with my grandma.
One of the most respected and disciplined figures in Hollywood, Samuel L. Jackson, made what seemed like a small and almost forgettable correction during an interview. But the way that moment unfolded across the internet turned it into something much bigger than anyone initially expected. The situation itself began with a set of viral yacht photos, images that showed Jackson alongside Steve Harvey, along with other well-known figures, appearing relaxed, smiling, and enjoying what looked like a shared luxury vacation. For the audience, the conclusion felt obvious. People assumed these individuals were close, part of the same inner circle, moving together as a unit of success, influence, and long-earned status. It fit a familiar narrative, one that audiences have come to expect when they see powerful names gathered in one place. And in most cases, those assumptions go unchallenged. Celebrities rarely correct those perceptions because, in many ways, there is no immediate downside to letting the public believe in a story that makes everything feel more connected and glamorous. But in this case, something different happened. When the topic came up in conversation, Samuel L. Jackson didn't simply smile, nod, or allow the narrative to continue. He paused, clarified, and very calmly explained that the situation had been misunderstood. He and his wife were on their own trip, the others were on theirs. The overlap was coincidental, not intentional. There was no shared vacation plan, no coordinated gathering, no deeper connection implied by those images. It was a straightforward explanation, delivered without emotion, without added commentary, and without any attempt to dramatize the moment. Yet, ironically, that very lack of drama is what made people pay attention, because when someone of Jackson's stature chooses to correct something publicly, even in a calm and neutral tone, it signals that accuracy matters to him more than perception. And that is where the entire conversation begins to shift, not because of what was said, but because of how people interpreted why it was said. In a space like the internet, where every statement is analyzed, replayed, and reframed, a simple correction doesn't stay simple for long. It becomes a signal, a clue, something to be decoded. People start asking questions that go beyond the original context. Why did he feel the need to clarify? Why not just let it pass? Why draw a line at all? And from those questions, a much larger narrative begins to form, one that extends far beyond a yacht, a photo, or a brief interview answer. That expansion is where things become more complex, because the moment stops being about what actually happened and starts becoming about what people believe it represents. And once that shift occurs, other stories begin to attach themselves to the original moment, creating a chain of associations that feels connected even when it isn't directly linked. Conversations about Steve Harvey's career, his public persona, and long-standing claims from other figures in the comedy world begin to resurface. Names like Bernie Mac entered the discussion, along with older industry debates about joke originality, performance styles, and professional rivalry. Even completely separate topics, such as public attention around Lori Harvey and Sean Diddy Combs, get pulled into the same narrative thread. And this is where it becomes necessary to slow everything down and look at the structure of the story, rather than just its surface. Because what is happening here is not a single confirmed storyline unfolding. It is multiple independent discussions being woven together into one larger interpretation. Each piece may have its own context, its own background, its own level of credibility, but when combined, they create the impression of a unified narrative, something that feels cohesive even if it is built from separate parts. The human mind naturally looks for patterns. It wants to connect dots, to find meaning, to create a sense of order out of scattered information. So when a moment like Jackson's correction appears, it becomes the anchor point, the center around which everything else begins to orbit. And once that process starts, it becomes difficult to separate what is actually known from what is being assumed. The correction becomes a statement, the statement becomes a signal, the signal becomes a story. But if you step back and look at the confirmed facts alone, the picture becomes much simpler. Samuel L. Jackson clarified that he was not vacationing with Steve Harvey. That is the verified event. There is no public record of him expressing personal criticism toward Harvey. There is no direct quote indicating conflict, disagreement, or disapproval. Everything beyond that exists in the realm of interpretation, built from external narratives rather than from Jackson's own words. At the same time, it is also true that both individuals have built their careers in very different ways, and those differences naturally influence how people perceive them. Samuel L. Jackson's journey is often described as long, difficult, and grounded in persistence, taking decades of work before reaching widespread recognition. His public image is tied to discipline, consistency, and a kind of straightforward authenticity that comes from having navigated multiple phases of life and career. Steve Harvey's path, on the other hand, blends comedy, television hosting, and motivational storytelling, creating a persona that is more directly connected to public engagement, relatability, and personal narrative. These are not opposing paths, but they are different, and those differences shape how audiences interpret moments like this one. And sometimes difference alone is enough to create the illusion of tension. Because when people see two individuals with contrasting styles, contrasting narratives, and contrasting public identities, they often assume there must be an underlying conflict even when none has been explicitly stated. It becomes less about what is happening and more about what feels plausible based on perception. And in an environment where perception spreads quickly, that feeling can become widely accepted as reality. What makes this entire situation particularly interesting is not the correction itself, but the way it evolved. A single, factual clarification became the starting point for a much larger discussion about authenticity, reputation, and the nature of public image. It highlights how modern storytelling operates, especially in digital spaces where information moves rapidly and context is often compressed or lost entirely. Facts and interpretations travel together, and over time, they begin to blend, making it harder to distinguish between the two. And that blending is what gives stories like this their power, because they don't rely solely on what happened, they rely on what people believe it means. So when you look at the situation as a whole, it becomes less about a hidden conflict and more about how narratives are constructed. It shows how quickly a moment can expand beyond its original scope, how easily unrelated elements can be connected, and how perception can shape understanding even in the absence of direct evidence. The yacht photo was real, the correction was real, but everything built around it exists in a space where interpretation plays a larger role than confirmation. And that doesn't make the conversation meaningless. In fact, it makes it more revealing, not about the individuals involved, but about the way audiences process information. It shows the tendency to search for deeper meaning, to question appearances, and to look beyond what is presented at face value. But it also serves as a reminder that not every moment carries hidden significance, and not every correction signals a larger story waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes a clarification is just a clarification, and sometimes the story that follows says more about the audience than it does about the people at the center of it.